Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this month's NERI seminar. We are delighted to welcome Cathal McDermott from the IGEES in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, who's here today to give us a very interesting paper looking at the structure of employment in firms in the Republic of Ireland. So the way we're going to work this is Cahill's going to give his presentation first, and then my colleague here in the Belfast NERI, Lisa Wilson, will hopefully join us to give a response to that presentation, and then we will have some questions and answers, and hopefully a bit of a good discussion. But without any further ado, I will hand over to Cathal to begin his presentation.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks for the invitation to speak at today's webinar. So I will just get these up. Would you just confirm there if that's showing okay?
Yep, that's great. Go for it.
Okay. So hi, everybody. My name is Paul McDermott, as Paul said, and I work in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform in the Social Protection Vote, and I'm also a member of the IGEES, which is the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service. So I'm going to talk to you about a paper that I co-authored with some IGEES and DEEPR colleagues last year, all about the composition of employment in small and large firms. And our focus here was really on leveraging the available data for insights into the different types of skills that we observe in small versus large firms. So I will launch into the presentation here. So we'll take about 15 or 20 minutes. Louisa, you might interrupt me if I'm going over that, but I don't think I will be going over that. And what I'll cover is I'll just give a quick overview of IGEES. I'll just introduce the paper a little bit. The bulk of the presentation will be the overview of the analysis, and then I'll finish off with key messages and ideas for future research. I should say that this whole area isn't really an area of expertise for the authors and myself who did the paper. We're kind of a project-based team, so I'm happy to discuss around the analysis that we've done. The discussion might get into broader policy matters in this area, and I'm happy to discuss those as well, but wouldn't be an area that I'm particularly familiar with. So to start off with the IGEES, so some of you might know what IGEES is, but it was established in 2012, the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service, and it was really designed to improve the evidence-informed policy making within the Irish civil service, particularly after the financial crisis. So since then, it's developed into a fairly developed cross-government network. So there are about 200 analysts across the 17 government departments, and the resources have kind of been growing over the years to reach that level. And those analysts, like myself, will get involved in all sorts of different policy areas, and there's a big emphasis on publications. So there are a couple of hundred papers at this stage on the IGEES website around all sorts of different topics. So well worth a look if you're interested. You can search for your area of interest on the website there. So one of these papers I'll talk to you about today. It was published in October 2020 as part of the spending review. So the spending review is where government departments publish a lot of papers en masse dealing with different policy areas. So this was one of those papers. The lead author was Robert Keogh, a former colleague of mine, and myself and my colleague Jasmina Behan, also from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, worked with Rob on this paper. So yeah, the rationale for the paper, as I said before at the start, it was all about kind of leveraging the available data to provide some insights into how skills and levels of education are distributed in firms of different sizes. And the rationale for looking into this was to kind of try and get under the bonnet of how this might be one factor which would explain productivity differences between firms of different sizes. So we know that in the Republic of Ireland, there's an expanding productivity gap between the most and the least productive firms, and this has been growing since the mid-2000s. But this will all be kind of influenced by, the large presence of multinationals, which has been increasing, and then maybe how they have overtaken SMEs and kind of continue to do so in the Irish context, and whether there are kind of policy implications or policy priorities there through which you might want to improve the prospects and the situation of SMEs. For the OECD's part, they have looked at this quite extensively, and they would suggest things like skills shortages, poor management practices, low levels of workforce training may hinder the performance of SMEs in comparison to these larger companies. And there are some survey results that would suggest that small enterprises can struggle to compete against larger multinationals to attract talent. You think of maybe Google in Dublin, being able to attract all of the talented ICT graduates, and maybe that is to the detriment of startups and SMEs in that area. So it's that kind of idea. So the idea here was to use the labour force survey microdata, which we gratefully received through the CSO's research microdata files platform. So we can access this remotely through our servers. And it's, the line by line data for the labour force survey. So that it allows you to be very flexible in what you can use the available variables to look at. And we use it in this instance to look at this question. So having set up the paper, I will go on to the analysis. So I'll whiz through about 5 or 6 of the key slides here, which tell the story of what we found. So the first thing that we looked at was employment by firm size over time. So we had 2 points in time here, 2002 and 2017. And this shows the growth in employment over that time. So over that 15 years, employment grew by about 73,000 jobs, which was an increase of about 7%. And you can see, looking at the chart here, that the bulk of the growth was really in those large employers, the 501 employees plus. There are some movements in the other firms which kind of net off, but yeah, largely that job growth of about 73,000, I think about 59,000 is driven by those larger employees. So that's the first thing to note, kind of an increasing presence, certainly an increasing percentage of employment in those large employers. The next thing that we looked at before we start to consider things like levels of education or the occupation, which we kind of use as a proxy for skills, is that the sectoral mix is extremely different across different firm sizes. And you really need to understand this and keep this in mind when we go on to look at the levels of education and skills, because different sectors require different levels of education and skills, and this will really color the upcoming analysis. So you'll see there that in in firm size 1 to 10 employees, it's very much dominated by retail, construction, and accommodation and food, which are the kind of labor intensive sectors where there will be a low skills requirement, and they make up about 58% of employment in that tier, in the 1 to 10. So then moving up, we can see it changes kind of firm size to firm size, and when you get to the 501 employees or more, it's largely comprised of manufacturing, ICT, and financial services. So the mix is quite different. So let's just keep that in mind as we look at the next slides. Okay, so getting into the mix of skills and occupations across these firm sizes. So this is looking at the proportion of employees which are in managerial or professional roles. So in the labour force survey, you kind of have different categories of occupations, and you can group them up into these broader categories. So managerial and professional roles, this would be things like directors, managers, scientists, kind of consultants, accountants. All these professions are grouped up into one broad group. So we're kind of just working with the data we have here, but we use this as a proxy for, I suppose, the level of kind of organizational and technical skills which are employed by these firm sizes. So you can see there's a very big difference here. Just focusing on 2017, it's the 501 plus employees where you have a large proportion of employees in these types of roles. So that's 57% on the right. And on the left, for 1 to 10 employees, it's 32%. So, nearly double the proportion of employees in the larger firms are based in these roles. This is across the private sector. So we're actually not looking at the sectors which you would typically associate with the public sector. We've carved all those out insofar as we can. So yeah, an interesting picture emerging there. But remember this. So this will color, this underlies all the other slides. So one way that we thought of trying to get around the sectoral mix a little bit and to see if you control for the sector in a way, does that give you a different distribution of these professions? So the CSO have a concept of M&E dominated sectors. So they use all their microdata and their data on ownership, and they identify a certain number of sectors where it is very multinational dominated. So these are things like pharma, ICT, medical devices, a couple of other things. But they're employers that you would know about. And when you control and just confine the analysis to these types of sectors, you'll see that the difference disappears more or less. Like there's no real discernible difference in the proportion of employees in these roles across firm sizes for these sectors. So we took this to suggest that though we may have less SMEs in these sectors, if we do have them, they do seem to be able to compete for similar types of skills. They may get kind of crowded out by the larger employers in certain instances, but at a high level, they do seem to demand these types of skills in the smaller firms, and they do seem to be able to get them to a certain degree. So if we move now to levels of education, which again is a proxy that we're taking for skills, this is looking at the proportion of employees with a bachelor's degree or above, as stated in the labour force survey. So one thing that might jump out at you from this chart is that the level is totally different in 2017, and I think this is in line with a well understood kind of trend in the level of third level education increasing in Ireland a lot over the last couple of decades, and you can see this across all the sectors. But focusing on 2017, you can see it's a similar trend that a higher proportion of the employees in the larger firms are educated at bachelor's degree or above. And again, just in case we forget, this is important to remember and to reflect on when we're interpreting these charts. But again, we did a similar next step where we confined it to these M&E dominated sectors, and again the difference doesn't disappear, but it's much reduced. So again, this kind of shows a leveling up, that if you control for the sectors, that you get relatively similar proportions of employees at bachelor degree or above. So yeah, that's all the education stuff and the occupation stuff. One more thing that we looked at, and we weren't entirely happy with the sources available here, but we did include them with a couple of caveats. So this is to get at another aspect of how belonging to a large firm might give you better training opportunities, lifelong learning, career prospects, and how this might also be a factor which is driving the productivity gap. You know, if you've access to better and more training through your employer, you know, that's quite useful. You don't need to go and proactively, individually look for these training opportunities and pay for them and undertake them. So there was a CSO survey in 2015 about continuing vocational training, and this showed that as an employer, the larger ones are more likely to provide training courses. So there's quite a big difference there. But again, you know, we have nothing here about take up. So all we can really deduce from this is that large employers are more likely to offer training courses, but it doesn't really go the full way to showing what we're interested to try and observe. And then on the right, the labour force survey has individual level questions about, you know, in the last 4 weeks, have you participated in formal or informal education? So we can see here, this is employee by firm size. So there are small differences here with employees in larger firms tend to be more likely to be engaging in formal or non-formal education. But again, we can't tie this to their employer. It's not causal. So we don't know that this is because their employer is offering the opportunity. It could also be because, you know, we observe that more of these people have a bachelor's degree or above. So, you know, maybe they're just more likely to continue in their studies in some fashion. So it's very hard to find any causal conclusion from the data on this. There may be other surveys that are available, and if anyone knows of one, you might bring it up in the discussion, but this is the best we could find for the Republic of Ireland. So that's all the analysis that I've got in the slides here. There's some additional pieces in the paper, which is online, and you can go and take a look if you're interested, but this is really the story of what we found. So the key messages of everything we've looked at there. So SMEs are still the largest employer, but we observed that over the last 15 years, a lot of the job growth has been in these larger employers, or they're certainly accounting for a higher proportion of employment now in 2017 than they were in 2002. So, you know, this may continue. You would be able to look at the data and try and establish this, but I think anecdotally, you know, if you think about where the jobs are being created, particularly in the big cities, you know, we can see that there are a lot of there's a high presence of large employers in Ireland. The difference in the sectoral mix by firm size, I mean, if you thought about it, you would probably have guessed at it, but I think the slide there is a very nice depiction of how the sectoral mix varies by firm size. And then the educational and occupational mix, it looks to be improving across all the enterprise base. Over the 15 years, I guess Ireland is becoming a more kind of a knowledge-based economy, more jobs in in the services sector, less jobs in construction and agriculture. And, this is kind of translating into a different educational and occupational profile for the population over that time. However, within a higher tech sectors, well, sorry, I skipped one there. The difference in education levels and occupation mix by firm size, we observed that when you just look at all private sector firms, there are big differences. That larger firms tend to have more professionals, more people with bachelor's degrees or above. But then if you control for the sector and just confine the analysis to higher tech, there are similar profiles. So we take this as some evidence, at least, that SMEs can offer high skilled jobs in Ireland, but that the scale of the SMEs is perhaps small and maybe behind some other economies in Europe and the US, etc. And then the difference in participation in lifelong learning. There's some evidence that this may differ by firm size, but perhaps some primary research or additional sources would make a better job of saying that with a bit more conviction. And then the last key message, I don't think we dwell on this too much in the paper, and we certainly didn't do any analysis on it, but you can imagine these kind of trends could be, I say exacerbated here, but they could be accelerated or exacerbated. It really depends how things play out with COVID-19. I mean, we've seen the employment effects have largely been in the lower skilled sectors, retail and accommodation and food. And by and large, the other sectors have remained in operation with remote working. So if that does lead to a kind of a trend a shift in the enterprise base and where people are employed over time in response to the accelerating effects of COVID-19, that may have an effect on all this kind of analysis, and also on the skills that are required of the labor force. Which skills will be demanded in the economy going forward, and how the government might play a role there in terms of upskilling the population to fill those roles. And the last slide is potential further research. So the paper didn't commit to following up. As I said, we were kind of a project-based team, so we move around from project to project. But with every paper, it's good to establish some potential further research, having done all the work over a number of months. So assuming data were available, we thought that some kind of analysis looking at spillover effects in terms of the movement of people from large employers to small over time. So you can imagine maybe someone now working in Apple, if you could trace them 5-10 years down the line, do they ever end up in a small IT company or a startup? Because that would be quite good evidence that in Ireland we've been able to leverage those skills that we get from the multinationals and actually absorb that into our own domestic enterprise base. But at the moment, I don't think we have any strong evidence that that's actually happening. Second thing we thought about was to account for the demand in skills among smaller firms versus larger firms. Like, do the smaller firms actually want these kind of occupations and these kind of levels of education? Do they need them? Is it holding them back? And again, we couldn't really directly get at that given the data that was available to us. And then lastly, you could extend this analysis into market outcomes. What I mean by that is into wages. So let's say we were talking about this group here. Would people who have the same types of roles be paid more in a large company as opposed to a small company? Because that would suggest that actually, the large companies do have the more resources and probably could crowd out the other firms in terms of resource and procuring those skill staff. So that's it from me, Paul. I'll leave it there and hand over to Lisa.
Okay, Cathal, thank you very much for that. Certainly a good deep dive there into what has happened to the labour market in the Republic, particularly on that. I think we all know a general trend towards higher education uptake, but sometimes just interesting to see it there in such stark terms. So I am now going to, I should have said at the start actually, for the questions and answers, there is the Q&A function there in Zoom. So if you want to bring up a question for discussion at the end for either speaker or for both, pop it into the Q&A and I will gather them all up at the end for the discussion. But I'm going to ask my colleague Lisa Wilson to share her screen and get set up for the presentation.
Sharon, okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay, yeah?
Yeah, maybe if you speak up slightly, but don't shout.
Okay. Grand.
Should be, yeah.
Thanks very much, Cathal, for taking us through the paper that you've done looking at the composition of employment. What I've done and kind of one of the things I was interested in when I was reading your paper is just, I'm based out of our Belfast office, is to say, well, how does this picture look in Northern Ireland? So I pulled out some of the data from the UK Labour Force Survey, looking at some of the similar things as you have for Northern Ireland and actually UK as an average. To allow us, I suppose, in the discussion or as I go through now, to draw out some of the similarities and differences and nuances between perhaps both labour markets, and maybe then in the discussion to kind of to perhaps draw out how you think this might link to that kind of broader productivity picture a little bit more. So I look first at the employment by firm size. So the left-hand side of the graph here is showing you Northern Ireland by firm size, and the right-hand side is looking at the UK average over the period 2002, and I looked to 2020. I thought, given that I was doing it just recently, I may as well make it as up to date as I could. But a similar story, I suppose, in many cases as to what you've seen, Cathal. You're seeing over time this increase in employment in larger firms. We couldn't get as much nuance as what you were able to get in terms of the 200. I think it was 249 as up to 500 you were doing. So we don't have the sample size in the Northern Ireland Quarterly Labour Force Survey to allow us to do that, but similar picture there, employment increasing in the larger firms. Slightly different at the UK level. So yeah, if you look at the right hand side there, you are seeing that increase in larger firms, but you're also seeing this increase in small employment in very small firms as well. So that 1 to 10, so that increase over time in small firms, where the opposite is the case in Northern Ireland. You've seen a decline there over the period. So Northern Ireland in that respect seems to be changing in employment terms more similarly, I suppose, to the Republic in that sense. Looking then at employment by firm size and sector, similar, echoing many of the things that you had said there in terms of the sectoral mix-up of our employment by firm size really does colour the picture of everything that is to come. So you're seeing employment dominated in the very small firms in the distribution sector, hotels and restaurants, whereas up in the larger firms, it's more concentrated in the manufacturing sectors, industry, construction there. So a similar sort of picture. I have left in actually the public sector into this of public admin education there, and you'll see obviously in the very large firms in Northern Ireland, a considerable proportion of those are employed in the public admin sector. Less so the case in the UK. In terms of drawing out some of the differences between the Northern Ireland and the UK here, manufacturing in larger firms in Northern Ireland, suppose 500 plus, a much larger proportion of employment is based within the manufacturing sector than in the UK. And I suppose that relates to the broader picture where employment in the manufacturing sector in general is larger in Northern Ireland as compared to the UK average. But where it does exist, it is in large employers. Looking then at employment by firm size and occupation. So what this chart does is looks at Northern Ireland in both periods 2002 and 2020, and does the same at the UK level. And it looks at the percentage by firm size who are in managerial, associate professional or professional occupations. And again, echoing the picture of what you're seeing in the Republic, I suppose the main story here in terms of the occupation and the education seems to be both the professionalisation and the increase in higher skills amongst the labour force as a whole. But that huge increase between in 2002, so that very light green bar in the 2002 Northern Ireland bar compared to what you're seeing there in 2020, very large employers have seen a huge increase in the professionalisation of those sectors over that time period. So I think it's 47% of those employed in the 500 plus in 2002 were in the managerial, professional or associate professional occupations. By 2020, it's increasing in Northern Ireland to 67%. And as far as I remember from your slides there, that is significantly more even than what you're seeing in the Republic of Ireland. But I suppose it echoes this picture of professionalisation of our labour force, but particularly so the increase in skills demands and in professional occupations in large firms. And that's, if you look at the picture there compared to the UK, that is actually quite different. So you're seeing lower proportions right across the board in the UK in those managerial, professional and associate professional occupations, and you're not even seeing the scale of the increase over time as what you've seen in Northern Ireland. So a different picture in many senses. And I think when you map, whenever I was your chart beside mine earlier, I was analysing that I thought the Northern Ireland picture looks more similar to the Republic of Ireland in that case than it did the UK labour market as a whole. This does what you had done in terms of looking at employment by firm size and then the percentage of those with degree or above level qualifications. And again, it's this picture of an increase in demand for high skills, particularly so right across the labour market. So you're seeing probably about an average of 15% there right across all firm sizes back in 2002 with a degree or higher level qualifications. It's averaged about 35 come 2020, and particularly that huge increase in degree or above level qualifications in the largest firms, so those 500 plus. And again, this picture is quite different from what you're seeing in the UK. You're not seeing that huge you're not seeing the base level in 2002 is lower, but you're not seeing the extent of the increase as what you do when you look in the Northern Ireland bit there. In terms of, you didn't actually touch on this in your presentation, but I thought from reading your paper it was one of the interesting things. So I just thought whenever I was doing the data work for this during the week, I looked at it by gender and also looked at it by employment type. and because I think actually they draw important discussion in terms of implications for job quality, and the link between productivity and job quality, I suppose, which I'll maybe put a few questions to you whenever I'm finished talking, because I'd just like to hear your perspective in terms of any thoughts that you might have. But I'll just go through the data first. But so what this chart does is it looks at employment by firm size, and the proportion who are female by firm size. Again, it does it over those 2 time periods, and it does it for Northern Ireland and the UK. And I suppose the biggest takeaway from this is that over both time periods of 2002 and 2020, there hasn't been that drastic of a change in terms of the proportions of females who are employed by firm size, with the exception, I suppose, of there's been a decline in females who are employed in a considerable increase in females who are employed in larger firms. So those 50 plus seeing an increase, but a decline in those 500 plus. So the picture in terms of between 1 and 50 employees has stayed fairly constant over time. And around 50% of employees are female over both time periods. But you're seeing a considerable increase in the proportion of female in the, I suppose, medium-sized enterprises. And in the large enterprises, you're seeing a decline in females employed in very large enterprises. That again is somewhat different to what we have seen at the UK level. It has stayed fairly constant as well, but that you haven't really seen much change in the very large firms. You're seeing an increase in the medium, I suppose, but the very large firms, you're not seeing that similar decline as what we just have done in Northern Ireland. And finally, I think this is my last chart or the last piece of data that I looked at, and I was looking at the percentage employment by firm size and the percentage employed part-time, and looking again at the 2 time periods in Northern Ireland and in the UK. And again, they're looking over both time periods. I suppose there's not much change in terms of the proportions who are employed part-time, but the key thing that stands out for me in this is the considerable decline over as a firm gets larger, the decline in the proportion who are employed on a full-time basis, or the increase as you go to smaller firms and the proportion who are employed on a part-time basis. So you're seeing there just 33% of those who are employed in firms with 1 to 10 employees working on a part-time basis, and then about 13% in 500 plus firms. And again, I suppose the change over time and the overall picture at the UK level isn't drastically different. And I'm fairly sure from what I remember, Cathal, you were seeing similar things in the Republic of Ireland data, where those who are employed on a part-time basis are more likely to be in those smaller firms and declining as you go up firm sizes. And that's the data, I suppose, that I've looked at. And if I can, Paul, as chair, kind of interject with, I suppose, even just starting the discussion back to Cathal and kind of asking you, have you any thoughts? Whenever I was reading your paper initially, and even then, you know, that's what kind of made me look at this gender and employment type. Have you any thoughts of the implications of, for those, I suppose, in part-time employment and those females in terms of job quality? So we know that those who are in larger firms have got higher mean pay. We know from the data that you presented in terms of skills, there are more opportunities for lifelong learning. We know that the occupational mixes, they tend to be more professional occupations, higher levels of educational attainment, that sort of thing. So I would just like to hear if you've any kind of comment, I suppose, about the implications for those who are, two parts of the question, those who are employed in smaller firms, what are their potential opportunities to change or to improve the quality of their job? And also, what are the implications for the productivity of firms in smaller firms if so much of the picture is coloured by that sectoral mix? So what are the opportunities there? So any thoughts or comments you'd have, I'd be grateful to hear. I'm sorry, Paul, for stealing the first question.
That's quite all right.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying at the start, it's just an area we dipped our toes into, but for the sake of discussion, I'm happy to try and pick up on some of the things that you mentioned there, Lisa. So, I mean, the potential opportunities for those in smaller firms, I think the sectoral mix in smaller firms is really the key thing there, because, you know, if you've got a lot of retail and a lot of what else do we have down there? Accommodation and food and construction. I suppose those are sectors that are kind of geared towards like labor intensivity. There probably isn't a whole lot of capital investment in those types of firms. Maybe with construction, you could argue that there's maybe a bit more scope for investment, but for retail, small shops and things, and for cafes, they're quite limited in terms of how they might seek to improve their productivity. Like, I think we often think about productivity in terms of manufacturing. I mean, maybe there is some scope for investing in nicer, faster coffee machines or something like that. But I think in terms of the opportunities for smaller firms, like it's probably more about government policy, maybe creating an environment in which you can get more, in which you can diversify the sectoral mix of those small employers, those SMEs. So maybe you get more SMEs in manufacturing and ICT and those types of sectors where you do tend to get kind of higher productivity. So that's what I would say on that one. The other thing you brought up there was any thoughts on females working part-time and the sectors in which they tend to work and what implications that might have. And there was a very interesting paper done by my colleagues in the IGEES unit. It was called Quality of Employment, and it looked in a lot more detail at the types of employment that different people have and how it suits their needs, if you like. So I think part-time work is a good thing if part-time work is what people want and it suits their other commitments. If part-time work is not what people want, but it's all that they can get, then that's obviously a different problem. And I don't know that paper well enough to start quoting figures, but I think if you look in that paper, you'll find things like the proportion of people in part-time work who would like more hours or who are happy with their hours. So, I think we should be cognizant that different work patterns suit different people, and it's not always a bad thing that they would find themselves in part-time employment.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting there what you said firstly about the sectoral mix, because being, and trying to increase the sectoral mix in the small firms, because I get what you're saying about part-time employment suits some people, particularly if they have other commitments or whatever. But in many ways, you can interpret the data by saying, well, your opportunities for employment if you're seeking part-time employment, are construed, you know, you've only a certain number of sectors that you can work in, and because that's the sectors that offer those opportunities, if you know what I mean. And there's not, you know, there's not as great a sectoral mix in small firms who are offering those, and but those are the firms that offer part-time work. So it's, I suppose, that is the key policy challenge here about trying to get a greater sectoral mix of higher productivity firms who will either offer opportunities for flexible working, or who, like, I don't think it's the fact that they're small firms necessarily. I think it's, you know what I mean?
Yeah, like I don't think small firms are the only firms who offer part-time employment. I think disproportionately they offer part-time employment, and that's maybe because they're cafes and their shops, which their business model suits part-time employment. But like I think a lot of governments now, like maybe they're looking at this in the UK and Northern Ireland as well, are looking at trying to foster, you know, a more flexible kind of working environment where the legislation and various government supports can actually support part-time employment across, and encourage it maybe across all types of sectors, so that people can, you know, they don't have to necessarily be in the office at certain hours, can work from home, can maybe do part-time working, job sharing, all this type of stuff. So I see what you're saying, that there's an interaction between the sectors that you find in smaller employers tend to be the ones who offer more part-time employment. But I think that's to do with their business model. And like, yeah, I think any kind of policy or legislation which can facilitate more flexible and part-time working in the more productive kind of high earning sectors, you know, would be a good way to go in terms of increasing opportunities for people who, you know, want to seek out part-time work.
Yeah.
Just a question in there from Michael Taft, looking in terms of, as you alluded to, in terms of future research that could be undertaken, or whether this, you know, this has been done already. That potential contrast between the higher wages and better working conditions associated in large companies or MNCs, and the contrast with that, and the more influence and control over work and business decision making in smaller firms, and whether that sort of sort of contributes, maybe, if either one of you want to take up that question. I think in terms of job quality as much as anything.
It's an interesting question. Thanks, Michael. So, like, I suppose what you're talking about there is a kind of a more subjective measure where it's actually about work satisfaction. That people may value, you know, being in that smaller organization where you're probably, you know, part of the community and you're probably friends with everyone who works in the company. Maybe you have a stake in the business, and certainly you might enjoy that kind of level of involvement. Whereas, you know, if you're in a big organization, you're kind of you know, you've got all these processes and procedures, and you're probably far away from the decision making. But unfortunately, not a lot of surveys would capture that kind of subjective measures of quality of employment. There probably is some kind of maybe smaller survey data which would capture that. I'm not aware of it, but certainly it would be something that would explain. Say if we looked at that data and we saw that the people in the M&E dominated sectors in small firms were earning less than people in the big firms. I guess the question then is, why don't they move to the big firms? And maybe it is about that kind of, you know, they started a business with their friend, or they wanted to move more rurally. But yeah, I think the data constraints kind of keep this kind of discussion at a bit of a theoretical level. But I don't know, Lisa, if you've ever seen any analysis like that.
I suppose the question is kind of related to one of the points that I was trying to make is that it appears exactly to me that if the people are having to make, based on the types of employment or the employment arrangements which are available by firm size, and then the interlinkage between firm size and productivity, it appears to me that individuals are having to make that trade-off, that if they want things like control over their work or more opportunities for flexible work, given that we're seeing that they're more likely to have employment opportunities in smaller firms than larger firms, that they're having to make a trade-off between the higher wages. Whereas in contrast, if you're looking for higher wages, you're more likely to find employment in the larger firms, or to have employment in the larger firms. There is like a severe lack of data which allows one to look at job quality across all of those dimensions at once. So looking at both the wages picture and the control over your work, or your autonomy over your work, by your sector or your employment arrangements. So there is a severe lack of data in the Irish context that would allow one to do that. There's a definite data requirement there to be able to do that, or to do that so that we can understand better when an individual is looking across the various dimensions that are important to them about the quality of their job. Are they making trade-offs, and how does this then link into those conversations about productivity, for example, and sectoral mix? So it's a good question, Michael.
And Michael has a follow-up here, sort of saying, it kind of came across there on what the two of you were talking about as a role for social policy in making smaller firms more attractive, so that obviously a lot of the benefits that we associate with larger firms, like better sick pay, better family benefits, that if that were, rather than a choice of each company, but a universal entitlement to all employees, whether that could make working in smaller firms as attractive as larger firms, obviously still with a pay differential there. But he's arguing further that if we had more public goods in terms of housing and health, that would dent the pay differential there as well. So that if we are to make smaller firms more attractive, do we do it from the policy, universal policy level, rather than seeking to create a convergence in wages, which is never going to come about? He put it more succinctly than I did, so I don't know how I managed to make his question longer, but if anyone wants to take that up.
Yeah, just a thought occurred to me there. I was at a conference from NESC on social inclusion there a couple of weeks ago, and this concept of more public goods and more subsidization, I suppose, for the stagnation in wages is a bit of a tricky question, because you might be moving into a realm there where the government and the public finances actually subsidizes the corporate sector for the corporate sector's desire to keep wages low and profits high. We have like national minimum wage legislation, but we would have a very large number of jobs in Ireland on the national minimum wage. So I think there's also a role for businesses here, to kind of to have a role in ensuring people have a good quality of life through the value and the income that is created from their activity. So I don't think you can wish that all away with spending and public goods. And I suppose that, like in Ireland, we're in a kind of a mixed economy, which is probably a bit less kind of a social aspect to it than Scandinavian countries and other countries. I'm not sure whether Ireland will start to move more in that direction. And I suppose if it did, that would kind of be moving towards a bit of Michael's point here, that you kind of provide more public goods. So you make wages less of the be all and end all. But I don't think you would want to subsidize the corporate sector entirely for their behavior.
Another question, picking up on the point you made about spillovers and the MNEs. Now I know, or MNCs, whatever we're calling them, and I know the data is obviously going to be limited, but just in terms of, you were talking about a spillover into smaller firms, but whether tracking workers moving from larger firms going into smaller firms, but whether it would be possible to track in the sector in which we have larger MNEs, whether there is a spillover from the MNEs in those sectors to the SMEs in those sectors, or the indigenous firms in those sectors. So whether the presence of big firms, foreign firms attracting talent, is raising the game of the indigenous firms that are also within that sector, and whether that's possible to glean from the data or not.
I think it could be, to an extent. I mean, you'll see from a lot of the analysis, at least now presented, like, it's trying to get at the crux of the issue with the limitations of the data. So we have trouble kind of, assuming causality. But one thing that you could look at there around the, say, proliferation of skills and activity from the MNCs into other employers is this concept of regional kind of clustering. So do you get more SMEs, ICT SMEs, in Cork where you've got Apple, or in Dublin where you've got all those companies in Dublin? They're obviously big urban centers, so you'd need to be careful about what kind of conclusions that you drew. But I think that clustering point could be interesting, and the data would allow you to explore that to an extent. I think spillovers from within sectors, like looking at whether individual employees move from large companies to smaller ones in the same sector. I think that the revenue data there could be quite rich. Unfortunately, it's not as available as the CSO data, but you can essentially track a PPSN number or an individual over time there and look at the employers. It would be quite a painstaking, difficult analysis, but I think it would probably be the richest source of data in the country to do something like that.
As I say, no pain, no gain. But look, we're just coming up to the hour there. So if there are no other questions, or Lisa, if there's nothing else you want to shout in with.
I just want to ask Cathal one last question, or kind of one last, just to hear what you think. So you said it during the presentation about one of the rationales for doing the project was to try to understand better the growing productivity gap between smaller and larger firms. I suppose I'm just asking, having done this piece of work now, do you think actually looking at the employment type and looking at those things and those breakdowns, has it told you anything about the productivity gap?
I suppose the things that I talked about, the OECD identifying as issues in the productivity gap, were skills shortages and poor internal management practices. So, maybe the smaller proportions of management staff in those SMEs speak to this somehow. But I think, the analysis that you do with the LFS, you're always kind of skirting around the issue without being able to, have the data to address it head on. So I wouldn't say, I think the paper that we did was interesting and insightful, but in terms of giving you solutions to the productivity gap, I'm not sure it would do that. It might give you some ideas of further areas to explore, or do like a bespoke survey or something like that. But no, I think it's one input into the evidence gap, but there must be other stuff going on there about, the ability of larger firms to organize and to invest, all of the intellectual property that they may have access to, the relationship to their parent companies in the States, etc. It's a big field, and I think the labor force aspect of it is just one smallish part of it.
Okay, thanks for that, Lisa. Look, just remains for me to say to Cathal, thank you very much for coming along and giving the presentation today. Lots of food for thought, particularly actually, and good to see the contrast here with Northern Ireland as well. So it made a very interesting discussion as well. I have to mention as well that the next NERI seminar is the 23rd of June, and that is Fran Bennett from Oxford University, who'll be looking at low pay and the living wage, if I'm not mistaken. And just as well to say that the annual labour market conference is the first week in July, the 6th, 7th of July this year, virtually as well, and that the deadline for submissions has been put forward to the 28th of this month. So do send us in your abstracts, and it'd be great to have as many papers in it as possible. But once again, Cathal, thanks very much for the presentation, and see you all again soon. Okay.
Thanks very much. Cheers,
Thanks,
Cathal.
Paul. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.